The first true terror aboard the pious Endeavour was not a sight, but an absence. The ship's chronometers failed, not with a dramatic explosion, but with a quiet, collective sigh. Every digital readout, from the grand master clock on the bridge to the tiny timepieces worn by ratings, simply stopped. The numbers froze, then scrambled into nonsensical strings of numerals or blank, accusing voids. The steady, metronomic pulse that had governed every shift, prayer cycle, and watch since leaving the Manville Point was gone, leaving a profound silence in its wake. For a crew whose lives were regimented down to the second, it was a disorientation more vertiginous than any spatial anomaly. Men found themselves unable to tell if minutes or hours had passed, their internal rhythms thrown into chaos, their purpose unmoored from the temporal scaffolding of Imperial duty. In the Enginarium, a realm of roaring plasma and sacred oil, Engine Seer Kovacs sought answers in the machine. His mechadendrites, neural link to the ship's spirit, twitched with aberrant data. The Geller field generator, that sacred bubble of reality, hummed with a stress frequency that grated against his augmented senses. He initiated a deep diagnostic, chanting the binary litanies of stabilization. The results made his organic heart stutter. The field was not merely stressed, it was feeding. According to the schematics glowing in his mind's eye, it was drawing immense, unsustainable power from the ship's primary life support grid. This was a physical impossibility, a violation of the most fundamental laws of the Omnissiah. The systems were not cross-linked, yet the energy was flowing, siphoned through conduits that, on the physical schematics, did not exist. The Geller field was sustaining itself by consuming the very air the crew breathed, a paradox that whispered of a deeper, more fundamental unravelling. On the lower decks, where the shadows clung thickest and the constant thrum of the engines was a physical presence, a guardsman named Rennick saw his death. He was patrolling a dim arterial corridor, his lasgun's power pack feeling suddenly like a useless weight. A flicker in the lumostrips cast a long, distorted shadow ahead. It resolved for a single, crystalline moment into his own form. He saw the familiar wear on his flak armor, the specific chip on his helmet's brow. The figure lay sprawled, a gaping, bloodless wound in its chest, eyes staring blankly at the riveted ceiling. Rennick froze, his breath catching in his throat. He blinked, and the vision was gone. Only empty grating and the persistent, whispering static from the Vox grills remained. He reported it, his voice a strained crackle to the deck officer, who dismissed it as fatigue. But the image was seared into him, a ghost from a future moment that had leaked into the present. It was a personal haunting, a fleeting horror that tested a man's faith not in the God Emperor, but in the very solidity of his own existence. The disorientation bred a low, simmering panic. Without time, actions felt meaningless. A crewman would begin a repair, only to look up and feel he had been at it for an eternity, his tools unfamiliar in his hands. Prayers to the Emperor for deliverance became disjointed, looping recitations, the words losing their meaning through repetition. The whispers in the static grew more distinct, not in language, but in intent, a sibilant, mocking undercurrent to every spoken order. The ship was no longer just a vessel in a storm. It was becoming a receptacle for the storm's echoes. The failing chronometers had severed the crew from their past and future, trapping them in a perpetual unraveling now, where the impossible, like a guardsman's corpse walking ahead of him, could step from the shadows and then retreat, leaving only the cold sweat of certainty that it would return. The first true terror aboard the pious Endeavour was not a sight, but an absence. The ship's chronometers failed, not with a dramatic explosion, but with a quiet, collective sigh. Every digital readout, from the grand master clock on the bridge to the tiny timepieces worn by ratings, simply stopped. The numbers froze, then scrambled into nonsensical strings of numerals or blank, accusing voids. The steady, metronomic pulse that had governed every shift, prayer cycle, and watch since leaving the Manville Point was gone, leaving a profound silence in its wake. For a crew whose lives were regimented down to the second, it was a disorientation more vertiginous than any spatial anomaly. Men found themselves unable to tell if minutes or hours had passed, their internal rhythms thrown into chaos, their purpose unmoored from the temporal scaffolding of Imperial duty. In the Engineerium, a realm of roaring plasma and sacred oil, Engineer Kovacs sought answers in the machine. His mechadendrites, neural linked to the ship's spirit, twitched with aberrant data. The Gellar Field. Generator, that sacred bubble of reality, hummed with a stress frequency that grated against his augmented senses. He initiated a deep diagnostic, chanting the binary litanies of stabilization. The results made his organic heart stutter. The field was not merely stressed, it was feeding. According to the schematics glowing in his mind's eye, it was drawing immense, unsustainable power from the ship's primary life support grid. This was a physical impossibility, a violation of the most fundamental laws of the Omnissiah. The systems were not cross-linked, yet the energy was flowing, siphoned through conduits that on the physical schematics did not exist. The Gellar field was sustaining itself by consuming the very air the crew breathed, a paradox that whispered of a deeper, more fundamental unraveling. On the lower decks, where the shadows clung thickest and the constant thrum of the engines was a physical presence, a guardsman named Rennick saw his death. He was patrolling a dim arterial corridor, his lasgun's power pack feeling suddenly like a useless weight. A flicker in the lumostrips cast a long, distorted shadow ahead. It resolved for a single, crystalline moment into his own form. He saw the familiar wear on his flak armor, the specific chip on his helmet's brow. The figure lay sprawled, a gaping, bloodless wound in its chest, eyes staring blankly at the riveted ceiling. Rennick froze, his breath catching in his throat. He blinked and the vision was gone. Only empty grating and the persistent, whispering static from the Vox grills remained. He reported it, his voice a strained crackle to the deck officer, who dismissed it as fatigue. But the image was seared into him, a ghost from a future moment that had leaked into the present. It was a personal haunting, a fleeting horror that tested a man's faith not in the God Emperor, but in the very solidity of his own existence. The disorientation bred a low, simmering panic. Without time, actions felt. Meaningless, a crewman would begin a repair, only to look up and feel he had been at it for an eternity, his tools unfamiliar in his hands. Prayers to the Emperor for deliverance became disjointed, looping recitations, the words losing their meaning through repetition. The whispers in the static grew more distinct, not in language, but in intent, a sibilant, mocking undercurrent to every spoken order. The ship was no longer just a vessel in a storm. It was becoming a receptacle for the storm's echoes. The failing chronometers had severed the crew from their past and future, trapping them in a perpetual, unraveling now, where the impossible, like a guardsman's corpse walking ahead of him, could step from the shadows and then retreat, leaving only the cold sweat of certainty that it would return. The audit was meant to restore order. In the absence of time, Captain Vane had ordered a full accounting of the crew, a tangible ledger of souls to anchor them against the creeping unreality. Task fell to the ship's purser, a gaunt man named Evans, who retreated to the data sanctum with his servitor scribes. They cross-referenced the initial manifest against biosign scans and duty rosters. The cogitators churned, spooling out reams of parchment. The discrepancy was not subtle. Names appeared in bold, active type that should have been struck through in the red ink of mourning. Crewmen who had died in a plasma conduit rupture 3 cycles prior were listed as present, assigned to active watch rotations in the lower decks. A gunner's mate, vaporized during a long-past orc boarding action, was logged as having drawn his daily ration pack that very morning. The list of the dead walking the ship's rolls grew with each passing moment, a morbid census from a reality where fatal accidents had never occurred. The news, when disseminated by panicked junior officers, was the spark in a powder keg. Confusion curdled into raw, screaming terror in the lower decks, if the ship's own. Records claimed ghosts were drawing rations and standing watch. What else was a lie? Was the man next to you truly alive? A work gang in Deck Gamma 7, already frayed by the timelessness and whispers, erupted. Tools became weapons as they turned on their overseer, accusing him of being one of the listed dead, a phantom in flesh. The riot spread through the cramped Habwarrens like a psychic shockwave, a chaos of swinging mauls and frantic laws fire into shadows. The imperial truth of the manifest had become a weapon of the storm, proving that not even memory could be trusted. Commissar Falk arrived with the cold finality of a glacier. He did not shout. He and his cadre of stormtroopers moved with brutal, efficient violence. His bolt pistol spoke twice, its reports thunderous in the confined space, decapitating two of the most violent rioters. The sudden, visceral finality of it froze the mob. Falk's voice, amplified by his Voxcaster, was a lash of pure authority. He declared the manifest a technical error, a corruption of data by the storm, and any who gave it further credence were guilty of heresy and cowardice. He promised summary execution for any further breach of discipline. His gaze, hard as flint, swept over the cowed crewmen. Order was restored, but it was a brittle, fearful thing, painted over the abyss with the threat of a bolt shell. The riot was quelled, but the deeper infection, the terror that the ledger of their lives was being rewritten by an unseen hand, remained, driven underground by fear of Falk. In the ship's small chapel, Chaplain Solon sought to combat that deeper fear. He gathered those who could still muster faith, their faces pale in the flickering light of the sanctum's candles. He led them in the litany of steadfastness, his voice a deep, resonant roll against the metal walls. The crew's responses began as a shaken murmur, but grew stronger, a defiant chant against the silence of the void outside and the silence within their own. Hearts for a few precious minutes, the familiar words wove a shield of orthodoxy. They spoke of the Emperor's eternal watchfulness, of the immutability of the imperial truth. The rhythm of the prayer almost simulated the lost tick of the chronometers, a spiritual metronome. It was then that the stone wept. The sound began as a soft, almost melodic drip, echoing from the chapel's bare alloy walls. Then it grew, a chorus of liquid misery seeping from rivet heads and weld seams where no moisture could or should be. The walls glistened, not with water, but with a thick, saline fluid that traced slow paths downward like tears. The litany faltered, then died. The congregation stared, their hard-won faith crumbling before the physical evidence of the ship's agony. The weeping stone was not an echo of the past, but a manifestation of the present sorrow, a profound, elemental grief that bled from the very hull. Solon's hand tightened on his Rosarius, his prayers now silent, desperate. Questions. The storm was no longer just testing their perception or their records. It was empathizing with them, mirroring their despair in a language of mineral sorrow, proving that even the cold, unfeeling metal of the Imperial vessel was not immune to the corrupting, sentient sadness of the warp. The solidity of the pious endeavor had always been its crew's foundational truth. Bulkheads were immutable. Corridors followed logical paths. A deck was a plain, level, and sure. That truth dissolved next. The ship's internal geography softened, then curdled, becoming a non-Euclidean nightmare. It began subtly. Crewmen taking familiar routes would find themselves inexplicably lost, a junction they had passed 10,000 times now presenting a stranger's face. Then the distortions deepened. A team led by Sergeant Hale was dispatched from the primary armory to secure a secondary plasma reactor in Sector Theta, a straight 20-minute march down the spinal maintenance conduit. They marched. With grim purpose, their luminators cutting beams through the increasingly viscous gloom. The conduit seemed to stretch, the far end receding into a pinprick of light that never grew closer. They pressed on, checking and rechecking their position against static-fuzzed picked feeds. After what felt like hours of trudging through the same endless tube of grimy metal, the light ahead finally expanded. They emerged not into the reactor chamber's blistering heat, but into the familiar, cooler air of the primary armory antechamber. They had returned to their exact starting point. Hale reported to the bridge, his face ashen beneath his helmet's rim. He insisted, with a fervor that bordered on desperation, that his squad had never turned around. They had marched in a straight line, following the unwavering guidance of their helmet-mounted compasses. The corridor itself had bent, twisting back upon itself like a Möbius strip crafted from plasteel and despair. Captain Vane, listening from his command throne, felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. This was not an illusion or a trick of the light. The physical space of his ship was now mutable, a puppet of the storm's will. The next discovery was worse. A missing crewman from a sanitation detail was found, or rather partially found, on deck Epsilon. He was fused into a bulkhead at the junction of Corridor 12G. It was not that he had been crushed or embedded by some catastrophic impact. The gray ceramite of the wall flowed seamlessly into the flesh of his left arm, shoulder, and part of his ribcage, as if the two substances had been melted together at a molecular level. His uniform was part of the wall's texture. His head lolled forward, eyes open and blinking with a slow, dreadful awareness. His chest rose and fell in shallow, agonized breaths. A faint, wet rasp came from his mouth, but no words, only the sound of air moving through lungs partly transmuted to inert matter. A Medici team stood by, utterly helpless. Any attempt to cut him free risked killing him instantly, and the tools simply skidded off the seamless join where man became wall. He remained there, a living monument to the ship's new, horrific geometry, a prisoner of a reality that no longer respected the boundaries between the organic and the manufactured. The crew gave the junction a wide berth, but his blinking eyes followed them in the periphery of their vision, a silent accusation. On the bridge, Captain Arcturus Vane ordered a full lockdown of non-essential movement and retreated into a shell of isolation. The panoramic viewports showed only the chaotic, color-smeared fury of the warp storm, a sight that offered no solace, only a mirror to the chaos within. He stared at the tactical hololith, its projection now a useless, shimmering blob of contradictory data. The shifting deck plates, the fused crewmen, these were assaults on the Imperial doctrine of order he had built his life upon, but a more insidious attack was underway within. His own mind, seated in his throne, the weight of his coat heavy on his shoulders, he began to doubt his own memories of the mission's start. The details, once sharp and clear, now felt slippery, suspect. He tried to recall the exact moment the astropath had received the summons from the beleaguered garrison on Cygnus Prime. Had the message been a standard distress cipher, or had there been an unusual, poetic urgency to the phrasing? He could not be sure. The face of the planetary governor who had begged for aid seemed to blur in his memory, features morphing indistinctly. The navigational charts they had plotted, had there been a slight, almost imperceptible anomaly in the Empyrean currents even then, a faint shadow they had dismissed as background noise. He questioned his own decisions. Why had he pushed the pious endeavor so hard to make speed? Was it truly duty, or had there been a subtle, external pressure, a whisper in the back of his skull he had mistaken for ambition? The foundation of his command, the certainty of his purpose, was cracking. If the ship's corridors could not be trusted, and if the ship's records lied, then why should the captain's own mind be immune? The storm was not just warping his vessel. It was meticulously unpicking the threads of his past, leaving him adrift in a present where every memory felt like a possible fabrication, and every command decision a potential step into a trap he himself had laid in a forgotten moment of compromised judgment. The horror had moved from the corridors and the manifests into the sanctum of his own skull. The scream began not as a sound, but as a pressure, a psychic tinnitus that vibrated in the fillings of teeth and the marrow of bones. It originated in the astropathic choir chamber, a sanctum sealed behind layers of black iron and warding seals, but no physical barrier could contain what followed. The choir, 7 souls trained to blend their minds into a single, clarion voice for the Imperium, succumbed as one. Their synchronized psychic death cry tore through the ship's psychic insulation like parchment. It was a raw, telepathic broadcast of pure, undiluted agony that bypassed the ears and hammered directly into the consciousness of every living thing aboard. On the bridge, officers clutched their heads, blood trickling from nostrils as the silent shriek painted visions behind their eyes, flashes of melting faces, the sensation of bones twisting into unnatural shapes. In the engineerium, men dropped tools, their hands flying to their temples as they briefly felt the cold void of space where their lungs should be. The scream was a wave, and it left a residue of shared, visceral terror in its wake, a collective understanding that the minds tasked with navigating the Immaterium had just been extinguished by it. Sanctioned psyker Lyra, sequestered in her own warded cell adjacent to the choir, felt the rupture like a physical blow. The Emperor's tarot cards she had been consulting. Scattered from the air, their fluttering freeze mid-fall. Her mandate was clear: shield the sensitive, contain the psychic backlash. She threw her will against the torrent, a mental bulwark woven from years of disciplined agony. For a second she held, then the visions broke through. They were not simple images, but entire timelines experienced simultaneously. She saw the pious endeavor in a billion states of decay. In one, it was a fossilized husk, crew turned to crystal statues mid-prayer. In another, it bloomed into a garden of screaming flesh, corridors pulsing with a single, cancerous heartbeat. She saw it age to dust in seconds, and in the same moment, saw it newborn from a stellar womb, its metals still glowing. She saw Captain Vane, an old man dying on his throne, and Vane as a babbling infant, and Vane as a thing of many limbs, piloting the ship forever into a screaming sun. Each vision was a possible reality, each as true and immediate as the deck beneath her feet, and the storm was feasting on them all, savoring every potential demise. Lyra's physical form convulsed. The strain manifested in ruptured capillaries, a lacework of red blooming in the whites of her eyes, twin rivulets of blood tracing paths down her pale cheeks. Her simple gray robes were dark with sweat, the mental shield shattered. She did not just see the timelines, she felt the storm's consciousness brushing against hers. It was vast, ancient, and hungry. It was not a random confluence of energies. It was a sentient predator, and the ship was not trapped within its environment. It was being digested within its belly. The storm's will was a palpable force, a desire to unmake and remake, to taste the terror of finite beings as they confronted the infinite. Gasping, her psychic senses screaming in overload, Lyra stumbled from her cell. The telepathic scream had faded to a dull, psychic throb, but the normal corridors now seemed alien, charged with the afterimage of the horrors she had witnessed. Crewmen shrank from her, not just from the blood on her face, but from the aura of catastrophic knowledge that clung to her like a shroud. She moved with a desperate urgency, a woman carrying a message that was itself a toxin. She found Captain Vane on the bridge, a statue of grim resolve amidst the panic. He turned as she approached, and the sight of her, the sanctioned psyker, the controlled tool, now bleeding and wild-eyed, struck him with more force than any enemy broadside. She did not bow. She grasped the railing before his dais, her knuckles white, her voice a raw, scraped whisper that carried through the sudden silence. "Captain, you must understand, it is not a storm." She swallowed, blood coating her teeth. "It is a beast, a sentient, hungry entity. The Jeller field, the anomalies, they are not malfunctions. They are the teeth. The ship is not sailing through it. We are being consumed, piece by piece, thought by thought." Her eyes, twin pools of red, held his. "It is learning us, and it is very, very bored." The blood from Lyra's eyes traced twin, delicate paths to her jawline, where it dripped steadily onto the polished deck of the bridge. Each drop struck with a soft, final tap, a macabre metronome marking the end of one understanding and the beginning of another. Her whispered revelation hung in the air, thicker than the ever-present static. Captain Vane stared at her, the strategic maps of his mind, already frayed by doubt, now dissolving entirely. A storm with teeth, a beast with a bored, cosmic appetite. This was not a phenomenon to be weathered, but a predator to be fought, and they were unarmed in its gullet. Lyra's body trembled with the effort to remain upright, her psychic senses still ringing from the choir's death scream. She forced more words past the metallic taste in her mouth. The storm's goal, she explained, was not merely to destroy. Destruction was simple, a momentary flare. Its hunger was more refined. It sought to make the ship's reality conform to its own innate madness, to rewrite the laws of physics and perception, until the pious endeavor was no longer an imperial vessel, but a perfect, screaming reflection of the warp itself. The shifting decks, the weeping stone, the paradoxical manifests, these were not attacks, but adjustments. The storm was sculpting them, patiently bending their world to its will. As if summoned by her explanation, the Geller field generator chose that moment to falter in a new, more profound way. The omnipresent hum, the background note of reality that every soul aboard had unconsciously relied upon, stuttered. It did not dim, but flickered in its quality. For a fraction of a second, the field's golden bubble of real space transparency vanished. In that fleeting gap, the true face of the immaterium bled through the viewports and even the interior bulkheads. The bridge crew witnessed a landscape of impossible, tortured geometry. It was a vista of pulsating, living flesh, the color of a deep bruise stretched over mountains of screaming bone. Rivers of fire flowed upwards into skies of lidless, staring eyes. Shapes that defied description convulsed in the distance, their movements spelling out silent words of torment. The air in the bridge itself grew thick and warm, carrying a coppery scent of blood and ozone. Then, with a painful snap, the Geller field reasserted itself, and the familiar, if now hateful, sight of the color-streaked warp storm returned. But the glimpse had lasted. It was not a sensor ghost or a hallucination. It was a window, and on the other side was the destination the storm had chosen for them all. The shared experience of that view, however brief, acted as a psychic catalyst. Isolated hallucinations now began to intersect, weaving into a collective nightmare. Across the ship, crew members who had never met, stationed in different departments, began seeing the same thing. It started in the periphery, a shadow that was too deep, that moved with a liquid smoothness no human could manage. A figure, tall and impossibly slender, standing at the far end of a corridor, its form suggesting elegant robes or perhaps elongated limbs folded close. It had no discernible face, only a darker blot in the shadow where a head should be. It did not approach. It simply stood, one arm slightly extended, a long-fingered hand gesturing with a terrible, patient invitation. A gunner on the port battery saw it reflected in the glass of his targeting scope. A laundress in the reclamation vat saw it standing calmly amidst the boiling water and steam. A tech priest performing rites saw its silhouette superimposed on the sacred machine runes. Each witness felt a specific, personal pull, a memory of a lost home, the face of a dead lover, the promise of quiet, of an end to the fear. The figure beckoned not with threat, but with offer. It was a silent salesman in the corridors of madness, peddling solace at a price the soul could sense but not name. The shared nature of the vision was its most terrifying aspect. Men compared notes in hushed, frantic tones, their stories matching in chilling detail. Their private terrors had been taken away, replaced by a communal one, proving that even their inner worlds were no longer their own. The storm was not just reshaping their ship and their past, it was now harmonizing their despair, conducting a silent choir of beckoning shadows, each gesture a note in a symphony of seduction towards a final, terrible communion. Engineer Kovacs retreated to the heart of his failing kingdom, the primary plasma reactor chamber. The space was a cathedral to the Omnissiah, a vast, vaulted dome where the air shimmered with heat haze and the light came from the contained star at its center. The reactor core pulsed behind thick layers of armored glass and hexagrammic wards, a heart of furious blue-white energy that should have beat in steady, predictable rhythm. Now its light was febrile, stuttering between blinding incandescence and a sickly, green-tinged dimness. The machine spirit's distress was a constant, subaudible shriek in Kovacs's augmented hearing, a note of pure agony that had replaced the once comforting hum of power. Around him, the crew of the Engineerium moved like specters, their faces gaunt with a terror that no amount of sacred oil or recited catechism could soothe. They looked to him, their master of the machine, for a miracle. Kovacs knew there were no miracles left, only ritual. And in the ritual, he saw a final, desperate anchor. He ordered the chamber cleared, his voice a grating binary static command. He needed silence, or the closest approximation possible in a place where the very air vibrated with wrongness. Alone before the reactor, surrounded by the forest of control consoles, feeder conduits, and pressure gauges, Kovacs began the sacred rites of reactor calibration. It was a ceremony of profound orthodoxy, performed on 10,000 ships across the Imperium. Series of precise physical and spiritual adjustments designed to soothe a troubled machine spirit and restore harmonic output. It was an act of faith in the order of the universe, in the relationship between tech priest and machine. It was the only language he had left to speak. With meticulous, reverent care, he initiated the sequence. His mechadendrites, extensions of his will, plugged into ancient data ports. His organic hand, pale and trembling slightly, traced the sacred sigils of stabilization on a console's dusty surface. He chanted the litanies of coaxing, his voice a low, rhythmic monotone against the reactor's erratic thrum. He anointed key junctions with the last of his hallowed unguents, the smell of ozone and incense fighting a losing battle against the creeping scent of ozone and something else, something metallic and sour. For a few moments, the ritual's familiar cadence was a balm. Here was procedure, here was known cause and effect, here was the Empire's technology and faith working in tandem as the Omnissiah intended. The reactor core flared once, a hopeful, brilliant blue. Kovacs's data feeds showed a momentary alignment, then the machine spirit wailed. It was not a sound through the air, but a psychic and physical feedback shriek that erupted from every speaker, every vox grill, every metal surface in the chamber. It was the sound of a soul being flayed, a high-frequency torrent of despair and betrayal that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly in the teeth and bones. The control consoles before Kovacs lit up with a cascade of catastrophic runes, every warning glyph blazing crimson at once. The massive plasma conduits that radiated from the reactor like arteries, usually sheathed in insulated ceramite, began to bleed. From seams and jointures, a thick, phosphorescent green fluid oozed forth, sizzling where it dripped onto the deck plates. It was not coolant nor plasma. It was vidi, the lifeblood of the machine, and it was weeping from wounds. No physical impact had caused. Kovacs staggered back, his mechadendrites whipping free in a spasm of shock. The sacred rites, the inviolable rituals of the cult Mechanicus had not just failed, they had been perverted. They had become a catalyst for a deeper profanity. The machine spirit was not being soothed. It was being tortured by the very prayers meant to save it. The reactor's pulse became a violent, arrhythmic hammering, shaking the entire chamber. The light strobing from the core now cast jagged, leaping shadows that seemed to move with malicious intent. In that moment, something within Engineer Kovacs shattered. The last pillar of his reality, the infallible union of Imperial technology and Imperial ritual, collapsed into dust. The logic that had structured his mind, the faith that had fueled his service, evaporated. The wail of the machine was not just a sound, it was a truth. It was the universe laughing at his presumption. The bleeding conduits were not a malfunction. They were the ship's final, honest confession. A strange, terrible quiet descended over his thoughts. The psychic scream faded into a distant ringing. He looked at the weeping, shuddering machinery not with a tech priest's analytical eye, but with the raw desperation of a child in a room of screaming voices. The solution presented itself with a brutal clarity. The noise, the pain, the wrongness, it all came from the machines. If the machines were silent, the pain would stop. If the systems were gone, the storm would have nothing to twist. With a calm that was more horrifying than any frenzy, Kovacs set to work. He ignored the blaring alarms, the frantic vox hails from the bridge. He picked up a heavy server-wrench. He did not chant. He did not pray. He simply began to dismantle. He started with the primary plasma flow regulators, smashing the delicate control crystals housed within their protective casings. He moved to the emergency containment field generators, severing power feeds with brutal twists of his tool. He was not performing repairs. He was performing an exorcism by demolition. With each severed conduit, each shattered regulator, the reactor's protests grew more frantic, the lights dipping toward catastrophic failure. Kovacs worked faster, his movements efficient, his single organic eye wide and unblinking. He babbled softly to himself, the words barely audible over the din. "Just make it quiet," he muttered, shattering a pressure gauge. "Make it stop. No more songs, no more bleeding. Quiet, just quiet." He He was systematically unmaking the heart of the ship, not as an act of sabotage, but as an act of mercy, a final, insane gift of silence to a vessel that could no longer bear the sound of its own suffering. The execution of Engineer Kovacs was an act of perfect Imperial orthodoxy. Commissar Falk performed it with the cold, ritual precision of a man applying a cauterizing iron to a gangrenous limb. He found the tech priest in the reactor chamber, surrounded by the sparking wreckage of vital systems. The servwrench still clutched in a mechanical hand. Kovacs did not resist. He looked up at Falk, his single organic eye serene, his lips moving in a silent plea for quiet. Falk did not inquire. He did not recite a list of charges. Heresy was self-evident in the smoldering conduits and the reactor's death throes. The bolt pistol rose, a black silhouette against the strobing emergency lumens. The report was a single, definitive thunderclap that echoed through the chamber and down the shuddering corridors. Kovacs's body fell amidst his handiwork, a final component removed. The shot fractured the crew more completely than any warp anomaly. For some, Falk was the last bastion of unwavering order, a stalwart defender who had struck down madness itself. These were the ones who still clung to the drill manuals and the chain of command as holy texts, who saw Kovacs's dismantling of the reactor as the ultimate betrayal. They nodded grimly, their faith in the Commissar's harsh justice a brittle shield against the chaos. For others, however, Falk had become the madman. They had seen the weeping stone, the fused crewman, the beckoning shadow. They understood in their guts that Kovacs had not been sabotaging the ship, but trying to silence its agony. In killing him, Falk had murdered the only soul who had dared to acknowledge the true depth of their torment. This schism did not manifest as shouted arguments or drawn weapons, not at first. It was a colder thing, a silent divergence in the eyes of men passing in corridors, a hesitation before obeying orders, a profound and irreconcilable split in their understanding of reality. Then time itself mutinied. The first sign was a gunner on the starboard battery who dropped his hydrospanner with a clatter. He stared at his hands, his face pale. He had just felt the kick of the bolt pistol, smelled the cordite, seen the tech priest's head explode, a vivid, visceral memory that flooded his senses. But he had been here at his station the entire time. The memory was not his own, yet it was. Across the ship, similar episodes erupted. A laundress in the reclamation vat suddenly screamed, reliving the moment she had seen Kovacs, hours earlier, babbling as he passed her post, his eyes wide with a terror she now felt in her own heart. A junior officer on the bridge blinked, and for a full 10 seconds was standing in the reactor chamber, watching Falk's pistol descend, before snapping back to his console, his uniform damp with cold sweat. The linear flow of events shattered. Crew members experienced moments out of sequence, vivid pre-echoes and painful recurrences of traumas both personal and shared. A man would be eating a tasteless nutrient bar, only to suddenly taste blood in his mouth and feel the psychic scream of the astropathic choir, an event that had happened days before. Another, checking a pressure valve, would have a fleeting but perfect vision of his own death in an upcoming plasma breach, a breach that had not yet occurred. The past, present, and possible futures bled together in a cacophony of dislocated sensation. Most haunting were the loops centered on the execution and its prelude. Men who had not been in the reactor chamber found themselves trapped in recurring fragments. They would feel the grating of the deck underfoot as they marched with Falk's detail, see the back of the Commissar's greatcoat, hear the preparatory click of his pistol's safety being disengaged, a moment that lasted an eternity, repeating every few minutes. Others relived Kovacs's final breakdown, experiencing the tech priest's despair as a phantom limb of emotion, the urge to dismantle, to make quiet, washing over them while they performed routine tasks. These were not mere memories, they were temporal ghosts, possessing the living and forcing them to endure key moments of the ship's unraveling on a loop. Discipline, already strained to its limit, now completely unraveled, Orders became meaningless when the crewman receiving them was mentally trapped in yesterday's prayer service or tomorrow's catastrophic system failure. A squad ordered to secure a corridor might freeze, collectively experiencing a premonition of being flayed alive in that same space. Work ceased. Prayers stuttered into silence as choruses found themselves whispering words they had not yet learned. The shared reality necessary for a starship's function dissolved. The crew became a collection of isolated consciousnesses, each adrift in their own splintered timeline, jumping from one traumatic shard to another. The mutiny was not against Captain Vane or Commissar Falk. It was a mutiny of causality itself, and every soul aboard was both its helpless victim and its unwitting participant, prisoners in a jail where the walls were made of yesterday and the bars were forged from tomorrow. Captain Arcturus Vane stood before the bridge's primary sensorium, a cavernous pit of flickering screens and dead readouts. The data stream was a torrent of beautiful, meaningless lies. External scanners reported the ship was simultaneously motionless and traveling at 90% the speed of light. Thermals claimed the hull was both freezing solid and glowing white-hot. Proximity alerts chimed for objects that were, according to the auger pictures, inside the ship's own fuel tanks. The sensorium's machine spirit, long past madness, had begun displaying the information as a slowly rotating, three-dimensional mosaic of abstract colors, a silent mockery of the Imperial need to quantify and understand. Vane's eyes, sunk deep in sockets bruised by lack of sleep, tracked the shifting patterns. He was not looking for sense. He was looking for confirmation. It arrived with a quiet, internal click, the final gear in a mental mechanism settling into place. Survival was impossible. The realization was not a shock, but a relief, a cessation of a hope he had not even known he was still. Harboring the storm was not an obstacle to be overcome. It was a digestive process, and the pious endeavor was being broken down into spiritual components. The shifting decks, the weeping stone, the screaming choir, the mutiny of time, these were not symptoms of a disease but steps in a consumption. Lyra had been right. They were in the belly of a beast. A captain's duty when his vessel is doomed is to secure the safety of his crew and the sanctity of his charge. The first was now a metaphysical impossibility. The second remained. He turned from the sensorium, his greatcoat whispering against the deck. The bridge crew watched him, their faces hollowed by shared hallucinations and temporal dislocation. They saw not a man, but a symbol of failing authority. Vane knew he could no longer command them in life, but he could perhaps lead them in death. His calculus, cold and precise, considered the variables. The Gellar field was a flickering candle in a hurricane, sustained by impossible paradoxes. The warp drive, however, was intact, a sleeping titan caged in the aft engineering vaults. It was the one system whose catastrophic failure might produce an effect not of the storm's design, but of mortal defiance. The plan formed not as a strategy, but as a prayer, a suicidal prayer ritual. They would overcharge the warp drive, feeding it every joule of power left in the dying reactors, bypassing every safety and sacred protocol. They would not attempt a jump. That would be like trying to swim in a whirlpool. Instead, they would force it to ignite like a bomb within the immaterium. The theory, gleaned from forbidden treatises on warpectonics he had skimmed decades ago, suggested such a detonation might create a localized reality shockwave, a transient bubble of screaming physics that could, for a microsecond, blast a hole in the storm's fabric, a temporary puncture in the belly of the beast. That window, that infinitesimal gap of scrambled Empyrean static, would be there. Only goal, into it, they would pour a final, focused astropathic distress call. Not a plea for rescue, that was a fantasy for children. It would be a testimony, a beacon declaring that the pious endeavor had existed, had served, and had been unmade. A data capsule of their final moments, shot into the void like a message in a bottle cast into a poisoned ocean. It was the only act left that held any meaning, to ensure their end was not a silent digestion, but a shouted negation. Vane moved to his command throne but did not sit. He placed his hands on its cold, ornate arms, feeling the engraved aquila bite into his palms. He looked out at the color-streaked fury beyond the viewport, seeing not chaos but an opponent. The calculus was complete. All paths led to oblivion. The sole remaining choice was the manner of their meeting. They could wait for the storm to pick them apart, soul by splintered soul, until they joined the beckoning shadow in its silent chorus. Or they could take the last spark of their will, the final gasp of their imperial faith, and use it to strike a match in the throat of the darkness. It would not save them. It would not even hurt the storm, but it would be an act of definition. They would die as men of the Imperium, choosing their end, not as meat to be slowly reshaped. The captain's duty in this final equation was to turn their annihilation into a sacrament. He inhaled the air tasting of ozone and despair, and began to compose the orders that would transform his ship from a vessel of travel into a single sacramental bomb. The remaining officers assembled on the bridge, a ghostly council summoned by the chime of a bell that no longer kept time. They were few. The master of ordnance was gone, fused into a gun battery. The chief helmsman had walked into a wall that swallowed him. What stood before Captain Vane were hollow-eyed survivors, their uniforms stained with more than grime, their postures betraying the weight of witnessed impossibilities. Vane stood before his throne, not upon its dais, but on the main deck amongst them. He was no longer a distant commander issuing orders. He was a confessor proposing a final, shared penance. He spoke without embellishment. He described the overcharge, the planned detonation of the warp drive core, the theory of the reality shockwave. He painted no picture of glorious sacrifice for the Emperor, for such glory felt like a lie in this place. Instead, he sold it as an act of ultimate, defiant faith. Faith that their will still mattered. Faith that a scream was better than a whisper. Faith that the imperial truth they had served, a truth of order, of cause and effect, could make one last, violent imprint upon the formless chaos consuming them. It was not a battle they could win, he said, his voice a low, steady roll against the background static. It was a statement they could make. A final, sacramental no, carved into the flesh of the storm with the last of their power. Their death would be a punctuation mark, not an ellipsis. Chaplain Solon was the first to move. He stepped forward, his Rosarius clutched so tightly the metal bit into his palm. His eyes, deep in a face lined with grief, shone not with hope, but with a fierce, approving fire. He saw not suicide, but martyrdom. A chance to offer their suffering as a focused offering, to transmute their meaningless torment into a weapon of testimony. He nodded, a sharp, decisive motion. The Emperor gathers his faithful to his side, Solon intoned, his voice gaining its old resonance. But sometimes he asks them to light the beacon that guides others home. This is not an end. It is a translation. Our bodies may unmade, but our final cry will be a psalm in the void. He would provide the ritual framework, the litanies of detonation and release to sanctify the mechanical act. All eyes turned to Commissar Falk. He had stood immobile during Vane's explanation, a statue of black leather and cold judgment. Now he stirred, his head lifting. His gaze swept the bridge, lingering on each officer as if memorizing their faces for a posthumous report. When he spoke, his voice was a whip crack of disdain. This is not faith, he stated, each word a hammer blow. This is capitulation, a coward's surrender dressed in the vestments of piety. He stepped toward Vane, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered pistol. Your duty, Captain, is to preserve this vessel and its crew for as long as the God Emperor grants you breath, to fight until your last bullet is spent and your last blade is broken. You propose to break the blade yourself. This plan is heresy. It is the abandonment of your post. The air on the bridge thickened, charged with a tension more immediate than the warp's distortions. The loyalties fractured by time's mutiny now crystallized. Some officers edged subtly closer to Solon, their expressions hardening into resolve. Others, those whose terror still wore the face of disciplined obedience, looked to Falk as their last fixed point in the universe. Vane did not flinch. The fight you speak of, Commissar, is over. We lost it the moment the storm tasted our fear. We are not soldiers on a battlefield. We are nutrients in a gut. I am proposing the only action left that resembles a fight, to choose the manner of our digestion. Falk's lip curled. You choose annihilation, I choose duty. His pistol cleared its holster with a smooth, practiced motion. It was not aimed at Vane, not yet, but held ready at his side, a promise of final authority. I am placing you under arrest for dereliction and heresy. All who follow this madness are complicit. His other hand moved to his vox bead to summon his stormtroopers. The standoff lasted 3 heartbeats. Then Lieutenant Kale, a young navigation officer whose brother had been the crewman fused into the bulkhead, moved. He did not shout. He did not draw his own sidearm. He simply picked up a heavy, solid-base data slate from a nearby console and with a grunt of effort born of pent-up horror and fury, swung it in a short, brutal arc. It connected with the back of Commissar Falk's head with a sickening, wet thud. The sound was profoundly, vulgarly physical amidst the psychic and temporal abstractions that plagued them. Falk stiffened, his eyes widening in shock more than pain. His pistol clattered to the deck. He took one stumbling step forward, then collapsed, a heap of black cloth and fallen authority. Silence save for the hum of failing systems. Kale dropped the slate, his hands trembling. He looked at Vane, his face pale but set. No more executions, he whispered, voice raw. No more waiting to be unmade. Vane gave a single, grave nod. He did not praise Kale. He did not condemn him. The act was simply the final, inevitable outcome of Falk's unyielding logic meeting the ship's unbearable reality. He ordered the unconscious commissar taken to the brig, a meaningless formality now. The path was clear. Across the ship, the word was passed not as an order, but as a summons. The final ritual began. Tech acolytes, under Solon's guidance, started the sacred, blasphemous work of rerouting all primary and secondary power to the warp drive conduit, etching prayers of unmaking onto the bypass panels. Gunners abandoned their posts, instead using Law's cutters to sever the safety locks on the drive's containment housing. In the chapel, the few remaining faithful gathered, not to pray for salvation, but to chant the litany of the falling star, a dirge for those who choose their end. The pious endeavor shuddered, not from the storm's manipulations, but from the purposeful, systematic dismantling of its own survival. Every action was a deliberate step toward the precipice, a collective turning of the key in a lock that opened onto nothing. The ship was no longer a vessel seeking port. It was becoming a bullet, carefully loaded into the chamber of its own destruction, a sacramental act of will in a universe that had sought to strip them of it. The final calculation was being entered, digit by digit, into the dying logic of the machine. The ritual of unmaking began not with a roar, but with a deep, resonant sigh that traveled through the pious endeavor's bones. At Captain Vane's command, the last of the power relays thudded into alignment. Every remaining joule from the plasma reactors, every trickle from the backup cells, every stolen whisper from the failing life support was now funneled into a single blasphemous conduit, the warp drive's core. The ship's internal luminescence dimmed, plunging corridors into a twilight where the only light came from the frantic, fading glow of emergency runes. The omnipresent hum of the engines dropped to a subaudible groan, a giant slumping into its final sleep. In the chapel, Chaplain Solon's voice rose alone, chanting the litany of the falling star, a somber, rhythmic cadence against the growing silence. The crew, those still coherent enough to understand, braced. They had chosen the shape of their end. The Geller field generator, starved of all power, did not fail with a catastrophic burst. It simply winked out. The golden bubble of real space that had held the storm at bay for so long, however imperfectly, vanished like a pricked soap film. There was no transition. One moment, the ship was a besieged island of physics. The next, the warp flooded in. It did not enter as a wave. It was an instantaneous replacement. Corridors ceased to be corridors. They elongated, their alloy walls softening into visceral, pulsing tunnels of slick, organic matter the color of a fresh bruise. The deck plates undulated like muscle tissue, and the air grew thick and warm, carrying the coppery scent of blood and the sweet, cloying perfume of decay. Lumo strips melted into glowing veins that throbbed in time to a distant, gargantuan heartbeat. The ship's architecture was being digested, rewritten into the storm's own grotesque anatomy. Crew fared worse. Those caught in the open were unmade or transformed by the raw, thoughtless energy of the immaterium. A rating running a final errand screamed as his legs fused into a single, boneless pillar that slithered against the fleshy floor, his upper body still frantically clawing at the air. A tech acolyte praying over a conduit watched her hands blossom into clusters of featherless, chirping beaks. Others simply dissolved, their forms unraveling like smoke in a breeze, their final expressions of terror lingering for a second longer than their faces before dissipating into the psychically charged mist. There was no malice in these changes, only a profound, indifferent creativity, the storm playing with the matter of their beings like a child with wet clay, heedless of the original form. On the bridge, the viewports were no longer windows, but wounds. The chaotic color streaks of the storm solidified into a panorama of living nightmare. Captain Vane, lashed to his command, thrown by loyalty and despair, stared out at a forest of screaming faces woven from lightning, at mountains of intertwined bodies that shifted and moaned. He had hoped in some secret, ashamed chamber of his heart that in this final sacrificial act he might perceive some sign, a glimmer of the Emperor's divine attention, a fragment of celestial approval for their martyrdom. He prayed silently, the words tearing at his insides. He listened with every fiber of his soul, past the screams echoing through the ship, past the wet, tearing sounds of the hull's transformation. He heard only laughter. It was not a sound, but a quality in the air, a psychic resonance that vibrated in the marrow of his teeth. It was vast, ancient, and endlessly amused. It was the storm's laughter, the bored, cosmic entity savoring the poignant futility of their defiance. The Emperor's silence was absolute. In this place, at this moment, there was no divine grace, no gathering of faithful souls. There was only the predator and its prey, and the delicious irony of the prey orchestrating its own consumption. Vane's faith, which had been a pillar, then a crutch, then a final, desperate weapon, crumbled into dust, leaving a void colder than the vacuum they had left behind. Deep in the engineering vaults, the warp drive reached critical mass. The carefully orchestrated overcharge had worked. The containment fields, stripped of their sacred safeguards, ruptured. A soundless, blinding pulse of unreality exploded from the core, a shockwave of scrambled physics that radiated outward. For a nanosecond, it forced a temporary screaming order upon the local immaterium, blasting a tiny, perfect hole in the storm's fabric, a tunnel of howling, gray static punched through the flesh and fire. In the astropathic chamber, now a grotto of crystalline growths, the body of sanctioned psyker Lyra, long dead from her exertions, convulsed once. Her mind, however, had been held in reserve, a final, pre-programmed spark. Into that microscopic window of ruptured chaos, Lyra's last vestige of consciousness hurled the ship's final testament. It was not a structured message. It was a compressed burst of raw experience, the fear, the doubt, the shifting decks, the weeping stone, the beckoning shadow, the taste of blood and ozone, and the cold calculus of Vane's decision. It was their entire damnation, distilled into a single, searing psychic ember. The transmission lasted less than a thought. Then the warp drive's energy, having spent itself creating the breach, collapsed inward. The reality shockwave imploded. The temporary hole snapped shut. The storm, momentarily inconvenienced, closed over the ship once more, its laughter deepening. The final, distorted astropathic cry echoed not through space, but through the meta-realities of the warp, a fading ripple in an infinite, hungry ocean. Its content, stripped of context, bled into the static of the immaterium as a last, broken sigh. We are unmade thens. There was only the storm and the feast and the silence. Centuries are nothing to the immaterium. They are breaths in a hurricane, grains of sand in a desert of screaming souls. In a quiet sector of the void, far from where the pious endeavor made its final calculation, the Imperial cruiser Eternal Vigil plied the tides of real space. Its gellar field hummed a steady, reassuring note. Its crew performed their duties in the comforting rhythm of shifts and prayers. They were unaware of the depth of the ocean beneath their fragile bubble of reality. Then, a junior astropath, a youth named Kalen, stiffened in his restraint throne during a routine psychic sweep. His mind, brushing the shallowest layer of the Empyrean, caught a whisper. Not a voice, but a pattern, a recurring, ghostly echo etched into the background static of the warp itself. He reported it as a sensor anomaly, a fleeting warp echo. The officers dismissed it as empirical drift. But Kalen, in his dreams that cycle, saw fragments, a corridor that wept, a shadow that beckoned, a captain standing on a bridge, his face a mask of grim resolve, staring into a storm of laughing colors. The dreams were sharp, visceral, and they repeated with minor variations, like a damaged pictorial looping the same few seconds of tragedy. The echo persisted. Decades later, a rogue trader vessel, the Starward Grasp, fleeing Xeno's pursuers, made a desperate micro-jump through a supposedly calm warplane. As they translated, every chronometer on board stuttered for exactly 3.42 seconds. In that frozen moment, the crew's auger arrays painted a phantom return, the silhouette of an Imperial frigate, identified by flickering runes as the Pious Endeavor, hanging in the immaterial void. Its outline was blurred as if seen through heat haze, and it bled a faint, mournful telepathic signal, a distorted cry of unmade. Then it was gone, and the Starward Grasp completed its jump, its captain logging the event as a rare warp mirage. The echo grew no weaker with time. If anything, it became a faint, fixed point in certain turbulent regions of the warp, a psychic scar that refused to heal. An explorator fleet, mapping the edges of a dormant storm, detected it with their sensitive psionic resonators. They recorded it as a temporal recursion loop, a phenomenon where a moment of extreme psychic trauma repeats eternally in the subconscious layers of reality. Their data slates described it clinically: a cascade of failing systems, a spike of suicidal energy discharge, a burst of terminal psychic distress, all trapped in a perfect hellish circle. The moment of the Pious Endeavor's self-annihilation had been so intense, so focused, that it left a permanent fingerprint on the local immaterium. The ship was gone, its matter dissolved, its souls consumed. But its final act of defiance had become a recording, playing forever for an audience of nothing. Somewhere deeper, in a place where concepts like where and somewhere have no meaning, in a fold of the warp untouched by time or light, a shadow observed the echo. It was the figure from the corridors, the beckoning silhouette. It had many forms, but here, in its quiet place, it was a presence of profound stillness and infinite hunger. It watched the loop, the frantic prayers, the overloading drive, the captain's silent despair, the final flash, not with anger at the attempted defiance, but with sublime appreciation. The storm was not a single entity, but a facet of something greater, and this facet had tasted a rare vintage. The crew's terror had been predictable, their faith had been commonplace, but their choice, their cold, calculated self-destruction designed as a statement, that had been exquisite, a note of poignant futility in the symphony of consumption. The shadowy figure smiled. Its smile involved too many teeth, arranged in patterns that would liquefy a mortal mind. The smile was not one of triumph, but of savoring. The storm was never sated. Its hunger was infinite, a void that could swallow galaxies and still yawn with emptiness. But moments like this, where prey turned its own death into a complex, bitter spice, were cherished. They were remembered. They were added to the collection. The echo of the Pious Endeavor would loop forever in the shallows, a ghost for lesser vessels to occasionally glimpse. But here in the deep, the memory of its flavor was preserved perfectly, a single, perfect drop of despair in an ocean of madness, to be tasted and retasted in the endless, silent feast of the warp. The storm had consumed them, and in doing so, it had made them eternal.